Welcome to World of the Jungle, where we bring heartwarming and inspiring stories about animals and their incredible journeys. Today, we share the touching tale of Shadow, a 30-year-old Mustang who had lost all hope until a familiar voice called out to him. This story is about the unbreakable bond between a horse and his owner, proving that love and connection can bring life back even in the darkest moments. If you enjoy meaningful animal stories and want to see more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to World of the Jungle. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an inspiring tale. Now, let's begin the story. Shadow, a magnificent 30-year-old Mustang, once roamed freely across vast fields, his powerful legs carrying him through windswept plains and sun-drenched meadows. His coat, though now faded with age, once gleamed under the golden sunlight, and his deep, intelligent eyes held the spirit of a warrior who had seen many seasons pass. But time had taken its toll. The strength that once defined him had begun to wane, and the fiery energy that once sparked in his soul had dimmed. In the quiet solitude of the ranch, Shadow stood motionless in the pasture, his body weak and his spirit seemingly broken. He no longer galloped across the fields or nuzzled his owner for treats. His appetite had faded, and he refused to eat, turning away from the fresh hay and crisp apples that had once been his favorites. His ribs, once covered by a thick and strong frame, were now faintly visible beneath his thinning coat, a silent testament to his declining health. Each day, his owner, Samuel, watched him with growing concern. Samuel was an elderly rancher who had spent decades caring for horses, but Shadow was more than just another Mustang. He was family. He had been there through Samuel's struggles, victories, and quiet moments of reflection under the starlit sky. The bond between them was unbreakable, yet now Shadow's eyes no longer shone with recognition. They were dull, lifeless, filled with a sorrow that words could not describe. Samuel tried everything to bring his old friend back to life. He sat beside him for hours, stroking his mane, whispering words of encouragement. He brought out Shadow's favorite treats, hoping to tempt him into eating. But nothing worked. Shadow lowered his head, his ears drooping, his body barely responding. The days passed, and hope began to slip away like the last rays of a fading sunset. The once mighty Mustang, who had galloped fearlessly across open lands, now stood still, as if he had already accepted his fate. His breathing grew shallow, his legs trembled under his own weight, and his once powerful stance had turned into a frail, unsteady posture. It was as if he had chosen to surrender to time itself, allowing the years to weigh him down until he could no longer fight back. Samuel, though heartbroken, refused to give up. He knew Shadow better than anyone. He knew that deep inside, beneath the exhaustion and weakness, the Mustang he had loved for 3 decades was still there. He just needed something to remind him of who he was, something to reignite the fire that had always burned within him. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Samuel stood by the fence and did something he hadn't done in years. He called out to Shadow, using the same familiar whistle and words he had spoken since the Mustang was just a young colt. His voice, though cracked with age, carried across the pasture like an echo from the past. It was filled with warmth, love, and the deep connection they had shared for so long. For the first time in days, Shadow's ears twitched. His muscles stiffened. His head lifted slightly, as if waking from a deep slumber. And then, something incredible happened. Something that no one had expected. Shadow took a step forward. Then another, and then another. The Mustang, who had nearly given up on life, was responding, not to food, not to medicine, but to the voice of the man who had always been there for him. A flicker of light returned to his tired eyes, and as he reached Samuel's side, he nuzzled his old friend's chest, seeking the comfort he had once known so well. Tears welled up in Samuel's eyes as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small apple. Shadow hesitated, then for the first time in days took a bite. It was a small step, but it was enough. Hope had returned, And in that quiet moment between man and horse, one undeniable truth remained. Love, no matter how old, never fades. Samuel, a weathered rancher in his late 70s, had spent his entire life caring for horses. He had seen colts take their first steps, Mustangs run wild and free, and aging steeds live out their golden years in peace. But none of those experiences prepared him for the sight of his beloved Shadow, his loyal 30-year-old Mustang, wasting away before his eyes. Samuel had raised Shadow since he was a young colt, their bond forged through years of companionship, trust, and countless shared memories. The Mustang had carried him across endless prairies, through harsh storms, and along trails where only the two of them had ventured. Now, the same horse that once galloped with untamed energy stood motionless in the pasture, his head hanging low, his once bright eyes dull with exhaustion. For days, Samuel had tried everything to help his old friend. He brought out the freshest hay, piled high in Shadow's feeding trough, hoping the familiar scent would stir his appetite. He cut crisp apples into small slices, placing them near his muzzle, just as he had done so many times before. He even soaked oats in warm water, making them soft and easy to chew. But Shadow showed no interest in any of it. He barely lifted his head, his breath slow and shallow, his once strong body now frail and trembling under its own weight. Samuel's heart ached as he watched the Mustang refuse every offering. It was as if Shadow had already made his decision, to stop fighting, to let go. The aging rancher gently stroked his horse's mane, whispering words of encouragement, his voice thick with emotion. "Come on, boy. You need to eat," he murmured. "You've always been a fighter. Don't give up now." But there was no response. No flick of the ears, no nudge of affection, no sign that Shadow even recognized the voice of the man who had loved him for 3 decades. It was as if the life had drained from him, leaving only a shadow of the horse he used to be. Samuel refused to accept it. Every morning he rose at dawn, carrying buckets of water, mixing feed, and preparing Shadow's favorite treats. He sat by his side for hours, talking to him, hoping for even the smallest sign of improvement. But with each passing day, the Mustang only grew weaker. At night, Samuel lay awake in his small ranch house, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought that he might soon have to say goodbye. The idea of losing Shadow was unbearable. This was the horse that had been with him through everything, through loss, through loneliness, through the changing seasons of life. Shadow was not just an animal, he was family. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange, Samuel walked to the pasture one more time, his heart heavy. Shadow remained in the same spot, unmoving, as if frozen in time. A lump formed in Samuel's throat. He leaned against the wooden fence, gripping the rough edges with calloused hands. He had seen animals grow old before. He knew what this looked like. Shadow wasn't just tired, he was giving up. The realization struck him like a blow to the chest. No matter how much he tried to feed and comfort him, no matter how many hours he spent at his side, nothing seemed to help. And for the first time in his long life, Samuel was afraid. Afraid that he was losing the one friend who had never left his side. Fearing the worst, he did the only thing he could. He took a deep breath, steadied his voice, and called out to Shadow the way he had done since the very beginning. A voice filled with love, a voice filled with memories, a voice that carried across time, reaching into the heart of the Mustang who had once run wild and free. And in that moment, everything changed. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the ranch, stretching long shadows across the fields. The air was thick with the scent of hay, the quiet hum of crickets, and the distant rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. Samuel stood by the old wooden fence, his weathered hands resting on the rough wood, his gaze locked onto the frail figure of his lifelong companion, Shadow. For 30 years, this Mustang had been more than just a horse to Samuel. He had been his partner, his confidant, his unwavering friend through the seasons of life. Shadow had carried him through endless fields, through storms that rattled the heavens, and through lonely nights when Samuel had no one else to talk to. The horse had been his strength in moments of weakness, his escape when the weight of the world pressed too heavily upon him. But now, the once mighty Mustang stood still, his body frail, his spirit dimmed. He hadn't eaten in days, hadn't responded to Samuel's touch, hadn't even lifted his head at the sound of his voice. It was as if something deep inside him had surrendered, as if he had already chosen to let go. Samuel felt a deep ache in his chest. He had done everything he could, brought fresh hay, hand-fed him apples, whispered words of encouragement, but nothing had worked. Shadow remained unresponsive, slipping further away with each passing day, and for the first time Samuel feared that he might truly lose the horse who had been with him for so long. He wasn't ready to say goodbye. Desperate, Samuel leaned forward, gripping the fence a little tighter. He knew there was only one thing left to try, one last chance to reach Shadow's heart. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then called out to his horse in the same way he had done for decades. His voice, though cracked with age, carried across the pasture, filled with love, filled with history. It wasn't just a call, it was a memory, a thread connecting them through time. "Come on, boy. You remember me, don't you?" The words floated through the air, mingling with the rustling wind. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, heavy with uncertainty. But then, a flicker, a twitch of Shadow's ears, a small shift in his stance. Samuel held his breath. Slowly, ever so slowly, Shadow's head lifted, his dull eyes searching the horizon. The sound, the voice, was familiar. It was something he had known all his life, something that had once meant comfort, adventure, and trust. And then, something miraculous happened. Shadow took a step, a small, unsteady step forward. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as the Mustang moved again, his once weak legs finding new purpose. The connection had not been lost. The bond between them, forged over 30 years of companionship, had not faded. Tears welled in Samuel's eyes as Shadow reached him, pressing his muzzle gently against his chest. "You're still in there, aren't you?" Samuel whispered, stroking his mane with a trembling hand. And then, as if answering, Shadow nudged him softly. At that moment, Samuel knew. His old friend had not given up. He just needed to remember. He needed to hear the voice that had guided him all these years, the voice that had always meant home. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple as man and horse stood together once more. And for the first time in days, Samuel allowed himself to hope. For days, Shadow had stood motionless, his once mighty frame weak and fragile. His spirit, which had carried him through countless storms and endless fields, now seemed broken. His ribs faintly showed beneath his dull coat, his legs trembled with every small movement, and his head hung low as if he had already surrendered to the passage of time. The Mustang, who had once galloped with wild abandon across the open plains, now barely had the strength to lift his head. Samuel, standing by the old wooden fence, had watched his beloved companion fade before his eyes. He had tried everything: fresh hay, crisp apples, soft-spoken words, but nothing had worked. Shadow had refused food, turned away from comfort, and shown no sign that he even recognized the man who had been by his side for the past 30 years. Samuel felt helpless. He had spent his entire life raising and caring for horses, but nothing had prepared him for the pain of watching his closest friend slip away. The bond they shared had been unbreakable, or so he thought. Now, looking at Shadow's lifeless eyes, he feared he had already lost him. But he wasn't ready to give up. Summoning the strength that had kept him going all these years, Samuel took a deep breath and did the only thing left to do. He called out to Shadow, not just with words, but with the same voice, the same tone, the same familiar sound that had guided the Mustang through his entire life. "Come on, boy. I know you hear me." His voice, though worn with age, carried across the pasture, weaving through the evening air. It was more than just a call. It was a memory, a promise, a bridge between the past and the present. For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, ever so slightly, Shadow's ears twitched. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't imagined it. The Mustang's body stiffened, his muscles responding to something buried deep inside him. He was listening. A flicker of recognition passed through Shadow's weary eyes. His head lifted, if only just a little. The voice. It was familiar. It carried warmth, history, and something that had been lost in the fog of exhaustion and despair. And then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, Shadow shifted his weight. His front hoof lifted, unsteady at first, then pressed forward. The movement was slow, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he had the strength to continue. But something in Samuel's voice, something in the way it reached into his soul, gave him the push he needed. Another step, and another. Samuel felt his heart pound in his chest as he watched Shadow move toward him, each step more certain than the last. The Mustang, who had once stood lifeless, was responding, not to food, not to medicine, but to the sound of the one person who had never left his side. Tears welled in Samuel's eyes as Shadow finally reached him, pressing his muzzle against his chest. The warmth was still there. The connection had never been lost. "You remember me," Samuel whispered, running a trembling hand through Shadow's mane. The old Mustang let out a soft breath, his body relaxing for the first time in days. And in that moment, Samuel knew. The fight wasn't over. Shadow hadn't truly given up. He just needed to be reminded of something more powerful than age, more enduring than time itself. He needed to be reminded of love. The night air was cool, carrying with it the soft whispers of the wind as it rustled through the trees. The sky above was painted in deep blues and purples, speckled with the first stars of the evening. Samuel stood beside Shadow, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and uncertainty. The Mustang had responded to his voice, had taken slow, shaky steps toward him, but the battle was not yet won. Shadow was still weak, his body fragile, his spirit teetering on the edge. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small apple. It was one of Shadow's favorites, crisp, sweet, a treat he had always enjoyed. He held it up, the fruit resting in his weathered palm, just inches from the horse's muzzle. "Come on, boy," he whispered, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Just one bite." Shadow stood still, his breath warm against Samuel's skin, his deep dark eyes locked onto the apple, but there was hesitation in his movements. For days he had refused food, turning away from even the freshest hay and softest oats. His body was tired, his will to fight nearly extinguished. Samuel felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was more than just a simple bite of food. This was a decision, a turning point, a sign that Shadow was choosing to keep going. Seconds passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Samuel held his breath. Then, slowly, tentatively, Shadow's muzzle moved forward. A soft nuzzle, a pause, and then, with a quiet crunch, Shadow took a bite. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His chest tightened, his eyes stung, but he smiled. A deep, genuine smile that reached his soul. "That's it, boy," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "That's my strong boy." Shadow chewed slowly, the taste familiar, comforting. Another bite followed, then another. The Mustang who had once stood lifeless, too weak to eat, was now taking nourishment, allowing strength to seep back into his tired body. Samuel watched as a spark of life flickered in his companion's eyes. It was faint, but it was there, like the first rays of dawn after a long, dark night. He reached out, gently stroking Shadow's mane, feeling the warmth of the horse's presence in a way he feared he never would again. The old Mustang, once at the edge of surrender, was choosing to fight. And it wasn't just the food that had revived him. It was something deeper, something stronger. It was the voice that had called him back, the touch that had reassured him, the unbreakable bond that had tethered him to life. Shadow was eating, but more importantly, he was living again. Samuel wiped a stray tear from his cheek and chuckled softly. Guess you're not ready to give up just yet, huh? Shadow nudged him gently in response, his warm breath a silent affirmation. The stars above shimmered a little brighter. The wind carried a softer tune. And in that quiet pasture, under the vast, endless sky, Samuel and Shadow stood together, not just as a man and his horse, but as two souls bound by love, proving that even in the darkest moments, connection can bring life back.